You may hear intermittent squeaking throughout this. That's just the dogs playing with a chew toy. Heads up on that. Anyway, hello everybody. Sierra Alpha Tango here with some exciting news. Today, YouTube mailed me something special. My official 50 subs aluminum award. That's right, I made it to 50 subs, which is tiny, but it was a milestone I'd had in mind for the last couple of months, and to have that finally come through was big. It just means I'm doing something less wrong than I suspected. Anyway, I thought I would commemorate this occasion by telling you 3 stories of my storied career as a backpacker. So what I'd like to do is tell you my first backpacking trip, my worst backpacking trip, and my favorite backpacking trip. So, 3 stories. My very first backpacking trip began, I think it was in September or October, and I had just recently bridged over from Webelos to full-on Boy Scouts, and it was our introductory backpacking trip at this one park called Austin Creek. We would take all the new kids there and have them learn the basics of what happens when your parents overpack for you instead of you packing yourself, and just kind of get a feel for it. And to begin with, my backpack was this old Kelty external frame pack that my mom had gotten from a coworker for like $20. And in retrospect, I think it was a really good pack, but I didn't know how to set it up, and so I had all this weight on my shoulders, and I didn't use the belt strap properly, so the weight wasn't going down onto my hips. It was a really uncomfortable time. The trip itself was about 8 miles round trip, if that, but it involved going deep into this canyon and then hiking out of that canyon again. It was my first time on a camping trip without any of my parents. It was my first time on a scouting camping trip. It was my first time backpacking. One of the adult leaders who had come along, Ralph, this guy's so hardcore, he didn't have a backpack, he didn't have backpacking gear. He carried in his hand one of those folding foam mats like you use for like someone sleeping over to play video games. He carried one of those in one hand and a grocery bag with all of his gear in it in the other, and he just trucked down into this canyon ahead of us. This guy was amazing. And I was this chonky young kid stumbling along with his heavy pack, and I just was completely amazed by Ralph and everyone else who could figure this stuff out, and me, I was just miserable. So we get down to the campsite, and that was my first experience cowboy camping as well, which cowboy camping means you're sleeping out under the stars, no tent, nothing. And so we set up camp, and my pad wasn't like a thermarest or anything. It was just this old closed cell foam pad that had been given to me by a friend I'd known from the church I'd grown up in. He had been a tanker. He had driven an M60 tank, and he just gave me a bunch of his old surplus gear, and that was pretty much my kit for a bit. I had a big heavy mess kit, I had a big heavy pad, I had a borrowed sleeping bag. It was my first time using a mummy bag. So we got down there, and we had macaroni and cheese and kielbasa sausage, which actually, come to think of it, that sounds pretty tasty right now. Anyway, we had our dinner, and we cooked around the campfire. My friend Ethan had got one of those Jiffy Pops and completely scorched it. And then it was time to retire, and I got into my uncomfortable foam mat and my sleeping bag. And about a week prior, I had read the Albert Ostman story, which, for those of you unfamiliar, is this alleged Bigfoot encounter where a man was out prospecting in British Columbia, and something was getting into his food, and so he tried to ambush it by hiding in his sleeping bag with his food, and the something turned out to be a Bigfoot, and it scooped him up and took him into this gully, and he hung out with them for a few days until he tricked them and ran away. In retrospect, it sounds really fanciful, and I don't really believe it now, but when you're 11 years old, yeah, I just spent the whole time thinking, oh man, Bigfoot's just going to scoop me right up in this nice little sleeping bag and take me away. I didn't sleep, spent the whole time jumping at every single sound I heard. It wasn't fun. I was going to swear off backpacking after that, but another couple outings and I got hooked, but that's it. Everyone has their own miserable first trip. It happens. Now, my worst backpacking trip, surprisingly enough, that was not my worst backpacking trip. So a few years later, I was about 14, and that's when I started to really get into backpacking. I had met a friend in my high school drama class, Brian. Shout out, Brian, if you watch these, let's go backpacking sometime. Anyway, he also was into backpacking, and we had gone on a couple of little trips, I think, here and there, including one revisit to that place where I went and thought Bigfoot was going to get me. That was a really fun trip. I'll tell you about that later. We made a lot of really stupid mistakes. It was winter break, and we were 15, 16, and we had decided, yeah, we got a long weekend, let's go down into my parents' canyon and go backpacking. For reference, my parents own 35 acres, and their property has canyons all over it in the foothills of Mount St. Helena. It's a really nice opportunity to have grown up out there, and that's really how I honed a lot of my methods for backpacking, was just, all right, well, I got a free weekend, I'm just gonna head down to the canyon and figure this stuff out. So anyway, we began planning everything at about noon, and his dad was gonna get off work at about 2, I'd say, and take him up and drop him off, and that was the dog flapping her flappy ears. By the time Brian had gotten there, it was already overcast and getting darker. We hustled down into the canyon, and I had the spot picked out, but we found that the way to it was completely overgrown with chamise, just packed, and we couldn't get through. So we just started looking for the first flat spot we could find, because by then it had already started to drizzle. It was getting cold, we were getting wet. We go down into the first flat spot we find in the bottom of this canyon. Brilliant foresight there. And we set up camp, and we brought along one of those Duraflame logs. We got that going in a little ditch we had dug, and we started a fire, and we cooked up. We just brought like leftovers along, like leftover pasta and meatballs and stuff. Finally get the tent up, and we get a little awning set up with a tarp, and everything's feeling pretty good. And then all hell just broke loose. Thunder, lightning, hail, just pouring buckets of rain. And we're sitting there just thankful to be in this tent as it's gushing on us. And we don't really realize the situation we're in, because when you're in a flat spot in the bottom of the canyon, there's only one way for water to go, and that's downhill to where you are. And our first sign of that was that the fire inexplicably went out. The hole we dug for the fire was below the water table at that point, and it had flooded and filled. Before long, water had actually gotten in through the floor of the tent, and by the time morning had come around, there was about an inch of standing water in the floor of the tent, and we were cold and miserable, and we struggled to tear down camp that morning, load up everything, and we're stumbling out of this canyon, cold and wet and unhappy, and like 30, 40 feet from our campsite is my dad in his slippers holding a cup of coffee. We had gone maybe at most an eighth of a mile. We were literally like a stone's throw from my parents' house. It was embarrassing, it was cold, it was miserable. I look back on it fondly because it was just a good time with a good friend. But, yeah. Now, my favorite backpacking trip. So I spent most of my 20s working as a night audit at a hotel family in the wine country of California. I'm not going to name names, but it was a good time. I worked a lot, but I had this beautiful advantage of, one, having a lunch break at 4 in the morning, so I'd go for a walk or go for a run while everyone was asleep, and it was amazing. And 2, I would get off work at 7:30 so I could get classes in. My weekends when I worked at that hotel were Wednesday, Thursday typically, and I actually really liked that because my weekends didn't coincide with anyone else's weekends, so I could go do my thing and I wouldn't have to worry about finding a campsite or anything like that. Everyone was just working. It was great. And 3, it was a very short drive from one of my favorite escapes, Point Reyes National Seashore. So on my weekends, very frequently, what I would do, I would get off work at 07:30, and I would go over to school, go take some courses in my college. Usually get there around like 9 and be in class until like 12. And from there, I would then hustle down to Point Reyes, get a campsite. Usually I would go to the coast campsite first. So go over the hill into the coast campsite and usually get there by the time the sun was setting. I would deliberately take a longer route, so it would still take me like 5-6 hours to get there. And then I'd set up camp and I'd get to the beach as the sun was going down with a flask of whiskey and a cigar, and I'd just hang out and enjoy myself for a little bit. If there was light enough, I would read, and then once the sun had set, I'd head back to camp, have dinner, go to sleep in until like 11, because at that point, by the time I'd gone to bed, I'd been up for like maybe 22 hours, and then hustle on down to the next campsite. Usually I would do Wildcat, sometimes Glen, sometimes Sky. It really depended on what was available and what I felt like. But I'd go to that next campsite, and I'd take a nice, long, languorous hike out there and probably get there about 3 in the afternoon, set up camp, read, relax, enjoy myself, kind of repeat what I did, where I'd find a quiet spot to read and have some whiskey and relax, and then have dinner at nightfall, go to bed. I'd get up usually like 3 or 4. I'd book it over the hill back to my car. I'd book it back to Santa Rosa and get some classes in, and then I would head home, clean up, put my gear away, and be in bed and up that night to go back to work. It was a very densely packed weekend, and I loved it, and that was one of my favorite things. I did that at least every other month. I was out there rain or shine. That was my big escape. I went to Point Reyes a lot when I was working the night shift. Anyway, just wanted to thank you all for tuning in and making 50 subs possible. Here's to 50 more. It'd be really nice, but I'm just enjoying making videos and sharing and being part of the community, and I hope you're enjoying what I do. And things have been rough in a few places, I admit, but I'm trying and I'm learning. Squeaking. I think that everything is getting better step by step, and just thank you for being with me through this step. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great day. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. Please consider leaving a like. I have a handy diagram here of how you should hit that like button.
Hey.
Take off! This is my side. Don't go over that line.
What line? I don't see no line.
There is a line.
If you put your mouth on...
Take off. I'm going to do the steamroller.
Take off! No way! Steamroller. I'm steamrolling you. Take off. Oh!
Steamroller.
Very handy. Until next time, thank you for tuning in. Have a great day.